Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Jayne, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for doing this conversation on maladaptive daydreaming because it's not getting the attention it needs. My name is Jayne. I'm a former sufferer of maladaptive daydreaming, but these days I have it completely under control and I've been a researcher on the topic. And also now I'm an advocate to help get it recognized.
So, what exactly is maladaptive daydreaming?
So it is this ability. Some people are just born with this ability to create these wonderful imaginary worlds in their heads. It's very different from like typical daydreaming that everybody does because that's more fleeting. These can be like hours and hours of intense daydreams with like fictional characters and plots. And it can go on for years, you name it, right? It runs the gamut. That in itself, though, is not disordered, right? That's a type of daydreaming behavior that I think a lot of artists, a lot of creative people do. It becomes maladaptive when it starts to interfere with your real life functioning, right? So there are some people that start to prefer these real life, not real life, opposite of real life, start to prefer these imaginary daydream worlds over their real life, right? And they start to find that they're spending more and more time of it, and they start to feel like they're addicted to it.
So, there's an addictive aspect, but it's a lot, probably has a lot to do with depression. I would think that once you exit out of one of these dream worlds or scenarios that you're in, you kind of go back to regular life. It's a little bit less exciting than what your daydream or whatever you were experiencing is. That's kind of how it is for me. Like if I exit out of a scenario that I have, I go into the real world and like, dang, I can't just jump off my roof and fly off into outer space or anything. There's none of that. I just thought it was like, oh, I'm going to be a good director if I wanted to ever make a movie or something like that. So there's the creative aspect to it, but I could see where it could interfere with real life.
Yeah, it absolutely. If it starts to like get in the way of you succeeding things in real life, it certainly can turn maladaptive. The depression part is interesting because I've heard that from a lot of people. So, I haven't experienced it personally in maybe 2 decades, but I am talking to people all over the world with maladaptive daydreaming. And that is definitely, I've heard a lot. Like these daydreams we can control in our head, right? We have total control. Like that's not what we have in real life, right? So when you come out of it, you could absolutely be depressed. But it's not necessarily that depression has to go along with the daydreaming. What we found is it coexists with all sorts of mental health conditions. So it could be depression, but it could be OCD, it could be social anxiety. People on the spectrum are more likely to do it, people with PTSD. So we found that a whole host of mental health conditions might lead to maladaptive daydreaming for some people.
Where do you see the most prevalence, like amongst certain disorders, I would say?
It's not fully recognized yet, right? So we're just starting to get the research in now, right? There's one researcher in Israel, an Israeli professor who's really like famous for coining the term maladaptive daydreaming. And he was in the beginning, he was the only one doing research, and I had the privilege of doing some research with him. But now there's a whole team of researchers from around the world
I think I
working.
know who you're talking about. I'm supposed to be speaking with him, I think, next week.
Yeah, Dr. Ali Somer.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Does that sound right? Yeah. So he came up with the term maladaptive daydreaming and really like was the first researcher to take it seriously. So the research is just really in its infancy. And so I don't think we know yet which disorders have it more. We just know that we've seen it in all of them. He might have more recent research that can, maybe answer that more specifically. All I can say is anecdotally, I've seen it with OCD, I've seen it with depression, huge numbers of people on the spectrum. And then PTSD trauma. I think a lot of people thought initially that it was a reaction to trauma, right? But we've since learned that yes, childhood trauma can lead to maladaptive daydreaming, but plenty of people have maladaptive daydreaming who don't have that childhood trauma.
Is the PTSD, I don't know how much research is on there, but is that a lot of like what could have happened or maybe something like that, like a scenario? Like I'd have to rethink that it was flashbacks of traumatic stuff from the past. But if you're creating the scenario again, does the scenario play on in a different way? Does it just repeat the same event, like a memory that won't go away?
That means certainly some of that, but I also, and when I'm talking like childhood trauma, if you're talking extreme childhood trauma, this need to just escape into a different fantasy world in whatever form that works for you, makes a lot of sense. And I think Dr. Sommer's very, very first paper, which over a decade, I don't know, maybe even like 15 years ago now, he had 6 people in his trauma practice, because that was his specialty. And they had all engaged in these elaborate fantasies, to the point like really extreme. Like I don't think any of them had jobs or friends or relationships. They just really retreated from real life, into these daydream worlds. And that kind of made sense, right? If you were in extreme childhood trauma, like this need to escape from real life and go into fantasy makes a lot of sense. But what I knew, because my experience, I didn't have those childhood traumas, is that more people, like, you didn't have to have those childhood traumas, right? Childhood traumas could lead to that, but all sorts of other things could lead to that as well.
Is it like a muscle? Like, can you train it to where, like, I mean, I think if you're doing it from when you're a kid, and I've done it, I mean, you ask any teacher while I was staring out the window most of the time when I should have been paying attention, it's daydreaming, but it gets stronger. And what I would have to think is eventually it's hard to sort out reality a little bit. Like, not saying it's like this kind of delusional thing, but it's hard to take back when it's when it's so intense. Sometimes you can have like a dream that's really intense. It's kind of the same thing, but you're awake and then snapping right back into something. And it's about finding, like what you said, the time and place. Like there's right times to do something like daydreaming, and then there's times that it impedes on your life, like driving a car.
Exactly. Oh my God, I used to be terrified, like driving a car, that I would like go into a daydream world. But I was such a bad driver and I was so nervous that I was too nervous to daydream. So it was okay.
And if you take the bus, you miss your stop.
Oh, yes, that has definitely happened to me before, right? You get into these fantasy worlds. About whether it's a muscle, like, I mean, I don't know, but I certainly think the more you do it, it starts like, I think of it, not very scientific, but like our brains are like computers, and you can get stuck in a pattern or in a role. Like, I mean, if I look back to my childhood, I didn't have that kind of trauma, but I definitely had some learning disabilities, some difficulties making friends. I was lonely. So I get why I needed to do it as a young child. But what I found is that I was doing better and better in my real life, and it didn't go away. And I think that's just because the pathways in your brain, like as you're doing it, the more and more you do it, I think anything, the more you do, sometimes the harder it is to stop.
Do you remember what some of your experiences were like some of the daydreams you would have?
Oh yeah. So for me, and this is pretty common, it was all TV shows, right? So I would take my favorite TV shows, probably dating myself because I'm, getting up there now, but like I would take like the Brady Bunch or the Facts of Life, and I
It's
would,
not that old.
yeah, but and I would make, different character, like different stories. Like at the end, the show would end, and I'd be like, particularly like the Brady Bunch was all reruns by the time I was watching it. And I was like, okay, I've seen these all before. Like, why can't they do something new? And so I just started creating new episodes in my head. In recent years, I found fan fiction. I just like stumbled on it. I didn't know such a thing existed. And I was like, oh my God, like this is kind of what I was doing back then, but not writing it down. And I do wonder if I had written it down, maybe it would have been less addictive, because I think while it was in my head, I felt this need to like do it over and over and over again. Um, but I do hear from people all over the world, and television is a very popular topic, right? People do take their favorite television shows and create new plots and new characters and all sorts of things.
It makes me rethink cosplay a little bit. We have those conventions that happen. I start wondering, is this people being able to live out their fantasy a little bit? Because at this point, I mean, I think everyone daydreams. I don't think there's not a person that doesn't do it, but how intense is it would be a question I would ask. And then also, how many people, like whatever scenarios they have, how many people are successful with it as well, too? I mean, I think a lot of people talk about, I had this idea and I did this. I was like, were you daydreaming? And most of the time I'm talking to a writer, they're talking about staring out a window or something catches their eye and they just get into this world and have to shut off from everybody and write it down or do something, where I'm like, well, there's a huge aspect of creativity to it. I'm just curious why no one ever really accepted it, or it's not part of the criteria.
So I mean, and we were talking beforehand, I'm such a strong believer that if someone is doing this and they don't think it's affecting their life, then it's not a problem, right? Because that is, I went public with this, I don't know, over a decade now. And in an article I did in the Atlantic, and I started hearing from people like all over the world. One hand, people who are really relieved because they knew they had this problem their whole lives, and it was just they thought they were the only one. Then I heard from people who are like, oh my God, I did this my whole life. I didn't know it was a problem. And now I think it's do I have a psychological disorder? And I'm like, absolutely not. I think, my niece lived with me for a while. She daydreamed more than I did, but she's an artist. So in no way, she did not believe that it hindered her life in any way. Right. So if you can find a way to channel it, then it's not maladaptive. But like anything, like it's a spectrum, right? Like if you look at alcohol, most of us like can have a few drinks and that's great. But some people like just go off the deep end and it really can ruin their lives. And that's what I see about daydreaming. Also another point you made about everybody daydreams, that is so true. But I think like the science, the definitions of daydream has created some confusion. So so I'll explain a little bit about that. Most typical daydreaming is a little more fleeting, right? Like you just kind of, I don't know, your mind drifts for a short period of time. It's more likely to be, potentially things in your real life, right? Or, maybe a celebrity you have a crush on, or telling your boss off, or like kind of wish fulfillment. It's less likely to be, though, taking fictional characters and making stories with them, right? Again, that's not bad. It's just less typical, right? To me, one of the differences though is that within more typical daydreaming, if someone interrupts you in the middle of it, you can just snap right out of it, right? And just, don't go back to it. You don't care. But if you're talking to someone not after daydreaming, if they're interrupted in the middle, it's frustrating, right? And they feel this need to go back to it. And so I feel like it's quite different from typical daydreaming. And, if I could go back in time, I don't even know that I would use the word daydreaming because I think it's what, like, I also was telling you before, it's not fully recognized yet. And because it's the word daydreaming, I think a lot of researchers and doctors don't take it very seriously, right? Because they're like, everyone daydreams. It's not a bad thing. To me, this is more like compulsive fantasy, right? Which is very different than your more typical daydreaming. Does that make sense a little bit? Or
Yeah, I would call it alternate scenarios if I'd probably rename it or something like that because I think the daydreaming, it's like much like ADHD. People are trying to rechange the name of ADHD to, I think it's like Dave or something like that. That means a different acronym because there's so much stigma that comes with that word. But I would lump this in the same category with ADHD with people not taking it seriously because a lot of people, like when I was in school, was just like, oh, you're a kid, you'll grow out of it, or it's all in your head. It's like, well, that's kind of the issue is like, we got to but it was never really accepted until relatively recently, and they're getting a lot more research on it. And whenever you talk about like daydreaming or something of that sort, people just think you're being creative and you need to know where to set your boundaries. And it's like that's true, but depends on the intensity as well, too. I mean, I always hate it when someone interrupts me if they'll always go like, "What are you thinking about?" And I'm like, now I got to go back to the beginning of the plot and show you everything and talk to you about it and walk you through exactly to where I was at and still going with it. So it's like I can get where that can be frustrating. And yeah, that's when it would start impeding on life. But, those escapes I also think are like just essentially important for a person as well, too.
oh yeah, for sure. Like, if so look, a lot of us spend a lot of time watching TV or like playing video games or reading books. Like if you're doing daydreaming instead of that, like that's great, right? It's just when you start to prefer your daydream worlds to real life, there's a problem, right? When it starts to interfere with real life relationships because you just want to go back to your head, to your fictional characters that you can control. I've talked to people who failed out of school, who, got fired from jobs because they couldn't keep it out of their workplace. So it's a spectrum. And when you start to lose that control of it, that's when it can be a problem. Um, a few things though. Lose control doesn't mean like you're hallucinating, right? Like I had someone ask me once, he's like, so does lose control mean you have absolutely no control over what goes into your head? I'm like, no, you're still in control, but it's kind of like, what's the best way to explain it? When I'm trying to diet and you put a ice cream sundae in front of me, right? Like I just can't say no to it, right? It doesn't mean that I'm hallucinating, but I clearly am in control, but it's just the pull is so strong that you can't leave it alone. Um, so I think again, when it interferes, when you start to prefer it over real life, I think that's a huge warning sign.
I'm This question's not really a question, it's more like different research areas that maybe I don't know where you've looked into, but like, is it like autopilot, for instance? There's that example of someone goes, I'm just on autopilot. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I'm on autopilot, but I'm inside my head doing something else. You know what I mean? That the daydreaming aspect. So that's weird because you're still functioning, you're still moving, you're still doing, I guess, what part of your routine is, especially if you're at work, but you might not necessarily be there, like kind of zoned out.
Yeah. I mean, so for me, it's funny because for me, you might have like there might have been no overt signs that was maladaptive because I was very high achieving in school and work and had friends and all of those things. For me, it was more a mental exhaustion, right? Because I never felt truly present in the here and now, right? Because I always felt this need, like, okay, I'm gonna finish this so I can go back to the daydream, right? Like, and I just felt like it was exhausting and really diminishing like the quality of my life. Um, I'll give a really good example. You know, so in recent years, I still daydream. It's just completely under control. And I think I'm a good person to talk about it because I think one of the few people who had it and now have like still daydream, but it's under control. So I really can tell what the difference is. So years ago, when I was daydreaming, I remember, colleagues would want to walk home. I live in New York City, so a lot of walking. They'd want to walk, you know, leave work together and go to the subway. And I would always make excuses to not go with them because I wanted to get back to my daydream. Now, like, um, just a couple months ago, I was engaged in a really good daydreaming as I was walking to meet a friend. But when I got to the restaurant to meet the friend, like absolutely no interest in going back to the daydream, like 100% focused on like the lunch, the conversation. And then when that friend wanted to walk back with me, like I was really, really happy. I wanted that. Right. Old me would have been like rushing to the bathroom every 2 minutes to like, check in on my characters, would have been like making excuses like I can't walk home with this person because I want to go back to my head. So this ability to really enjoy the present moment, I didn't have for the first 25 years of my life.
I think it's ease of access. When you look at like how easy it is to just be able to lay down and go inside your head and, live in this alternate kind of reality compared to, going and hanging with friends. The friend thing might be fun and you might really appreciate it. I get that all the time. Like if someone wants to go out to a bar, I'm like, I don't want to go out to a bar. I'd rather just like, mindlessly scroll on my phone and just be inside my own head for a little bit. And then you go there and you're having a great time and you tell you like, why did I ever not want to go and do this? But it's that ease of access. I wonder, I mean, how relatively recent is the research trend that's kind of sparking up with it? Like, did some of this take off because of the pandemic related? I would have to feel like a lot of it, people being inside their house with nothing to do, boredom would start creating daydreams a little bit more.
Yeah, the research is definitely showing, and if you're going to talk to Dr. Sommer, is showing that it spiked tremendously during the pandemic, which made a lot of sense. In fact, in the very early days of the pandemic, I actually, for I don't know, a month there, started to feel it come back, and I had almost forgotten what compulsive daydreaming was like. And I was like, okay, I remember this now. Like to the point where like couldn't even watch a TV show because watching a TV show like would give me ideas for my fantasy world, or reading a book would give me ideas for the fantasy world. And I was like, oh yeah, this is what I used to have. I got lucky. For me, it was only, in the very, very beginning of the pandemic. But for sure, it is absolutely spiked during the pandemic. And Okay.
I was going to say, is there any research that shows that maybe they could be deep down achievements or goals that people want? Kind of like dreams are. Like sometimes you dream about something you want to do or something like that. But if you're putting yourself in movie scenarios, I do that all the time. And sometimes TV shows and sometimes music stuff for some reason. But I just go, my whole family's music. I'm the only one that didn't pick that up. I'm like, is that something I wanted to accomplish down the road, or is that something that? So I have to feel like it, whatever you're daydreaming about, necessarily can't get superpowers unless someone drops you in a vat of whatever. Uh, but I feel like, you get into a point where maybe those are trying to release some inner achievements or some goals that you might want to do.
Yeah, everybody's different, but yes, there's a lot of that. I, for one, like I had a learning disability and some like just muscle. I found out later in adulthood that I've had autoimmune disease that caused me to be very weak. So a lot of my childhood daydreams, if I was in it and not the fictional characters, because I did both kinds, I was like, a star swimmer, a star ice skater, like all things I couldn't do in real life. So for sure, there is an element of that, but everybody's different. Like I know one person who's like, she's just created like generations of fictional characters, right? Like she's just got a soap opera with like, generations, different jobs, different families. Like she's basically writing a soap opera in her head. And so there's no wish fulfillment there because she's not even. So it's wish fulfillment is very common. But it doesn't have to be there. And that's kind of a theme with a lot of what I'm saying. A lot of these things are very common, but everybody's different.
Have you looked into the game Sims at all?
I've heard about it, yes.
So
And
it's like creating a fake life and having, and I know a lot of people that do it, but that a lot of the reasons why some of those people, and I've played Sims and it's one of my favorite games, but when you create this fake life, it's because there's pressures. When you're a kid, you're told like you got to get a job and you got to work really hard, get a career so you can have a wonderful life and a family and a beautiful house and all these types of things. Maybe that's my own childhood, but a lot of my friends have experienced similar conditions where I start going, is that applied pressure only going to create this type of daydreaming as well too? Because people want that perfect life, and if your life isn't exactly perfect like the one you envisioned when you were a kid and you're going to be president and also astronaut, then you try and find ways to tweak it.
oh, for sure. Like, I've read because I did some early research, but for a while, I'm an attorney, but I went back to school to study psychology and I did do some research on maladaptive daydreaming. And so I had people send me a few paragraphs of their most common daydreams. And one was, I remember very vividly, he was like, oh, I'm a famous surgeon and I make X amount of money, or I'm like a pilot and I make X, and like the details of the dollar.
He's dreaming up 401ks.
Yeah, I was like, the detail of it was really fascinating. But again, everybody's daydreams are different. Whereas like my friend who's just got a fictional like universe in her head, she's not in it at all. Like I think it meets different needs for different people. That reminded me something though. I want to go a little bit back to the to me, the problem with the word daydreaming. And there was like decades and decades ago, there was research that says that like 96% of humans daydream, right? And then so when there was a case study about me at some point, anonymously, but a case study, and some of the feedback that we heard was that everyone daydreams, right? So like, and I think it was 95% of people daydream it, and then like a huge percentage of thought for everybody is daydreaming. So this particular researcher said there's like no such thing as too much. We all daydream all day long. The problem though is the definition, right? They in that science word, they use daydreaming and mind wandering to kind of mean the same thing, which is basically any off-task thought, right? So that means like you're in the middle of class and you start thinking about like what I want to eat for dinner, right? Or you start thinking about your to-do list, or like, so most of us, our entire lives our mind is drifting to those things. And that's why no one really like could take too much daydreaming that seriously. But this is different, right? And back to that name, like this is more like that fantasy, the alternate universe you mentioned. So it's a very different thing. And I will remember this to this day. So again, dating myself, I grew up before the internet, right? Um, no one had heard of maladaptive daydreaming. It was no such thing. I spent I spent so much time reading psych books trying to find like anything at all like me, and there was no such thing. And I remember like finally telling my parents I was 17, and they just laughed. They're like, daydreaming, like that's just, that can't be a problem. And then years later, when I started doing the research, I showed my father some of the examples of people's daydreams without their names on it, of course. And my father just looked at it and he's like, oh my God, these people are batshit crazy. And I was like, wait, this is what I did. You said there was nothing wrong with me. And he said, okay, but I didn't know you did this. Like, I would have driven you right to the mental hospital. Not that it is batshit crazy. That it is not. Like I said, it could be absolutely totally fine. But my point is that I think when you just say the word daydreaming, nobody takes it too seriously, right?
I think with future technology, if there's implemented to some of this research, you can make a virtual reality simulation that can make it as intense as what probably people are experiencing. I think that's what people need. If they don't necessarily have the serious intensity of it, and if we figure out what the intensity is, mine are pretty intense. Like I could tell you, it's kind of like when someone wakes up from a dream and it's like a nightmare type deal. That's how some of my daydreams are. They don't go bad. It's just the intensity is very there. So I feel like people need to experience that a little bit. But is there any research on memory with that? I feel like a lot of people's daydreams, at least mine, sometimes I take a memory and I start kind of, trying to, just live in it a little bit. And that can be bad, only because you can mess with it and it can start to alter what that memory was. So when you try and recall it again, if I'm talking to someone, I'm like, there's this. And my buddy said, we never met Michael Jordan. I was like, hold on a minute. We were at the basketball game and Michael Jordan walked right by us. He goes, nah, man, no, it's never happened. It's never happened. I'm like, oh God.
So that's interesting. I mean, I think the first answer is I don't know. One thing is pretty clear is that people generally don't confuse, people not out daydreaming don't generally like confuse their daydreams with reality. I'm not talking about memories, right? But in general, they know that their daydreaming is just daydreaming, right? And so that's why it's not, schizophrenia, it's not hallucinating. People know that they're daydreaming. But memory is a different, I mean, a different, I think, issue in that, and I haven't seen the research. Dr. Sommer might know if there's some, but I could see that you're not fully paying attention to your real life, right? So that means you might less likely to remember because you weren't fully present and paying attention, right? So while it's not necessarily confusing daydreaming with reality, I think your memories of reality are lacking, right? So you can therefore fill it in with daydreams. I don't know if that made any sense, but
It did.
like I mean, the way memory works is that the more present you are, the more likely you're going to remember something. So if you're only half paying attention, um, your memory of it is not going to be so great, and then you might fill in some details.
Is there an area in particular for you that you would like to see more research in when it comes to maybe a specific, it could be a disorder or it could be just maybe even an age range, be able to test out, if are children experiencing this, does it start early or is it something that just happens through someone's life? Could they be an adult and just randomly get it?
I mean, well, first of all, answer that. Most of the time, it does happen young. I don't think I've met too many people who had it didn't didn't do something similar in childhood and young adulthood, and then all of a sudden develops it in an older age. Not saying it's not possible. That's just not what I've seen. To start with, I just want it recognized, right? I want it in the DSM. I don't know if your listeners know what that is, but the book with all the psychological diagnoses, it's not in that, right? So until it's in it, I don't even think that enough people are taking it seriously. So let's start there. Um, and then I'd like to see treatment for the people who really want it, the people who think it's hindering their lives. There's really not, because it's not a known entity, there's not a lot of studies about what works. And I just get emails from people all over the world being like, this is ruining my life. Like, I can't focus in school. I have no friends because my friends have all, got rid of me because I don't go out with them. I prefer to stay home. And they want to stop and they just can't. So I would like to see some research um, on treatment. And I also hear from parents around the world um, who see their children, and we didn't discuss this, but a large percentage of people not active daydreaming use some sort of movement. I know you mentioned that, it's when you work out. Um, for some reason, movement helps it. So sometimes, and I did this as a child, like kids are like spinning in circles and flapping their hands, and the parents don't like how that looks. And they're therefore um wanting to stop the child. And I'm always like, wait a second. The fact that they're doing it how it looks does not necessarily mean it's a problem, right? It's a problem if again, all the things I said, they're not focusing on school, they're not making friends. But I do hear from parents all over the world being like, why is my child spinning in circles? And what can I do to stop it?
Is when it comes to treatment options, like what are some ideas? Like, are we talking about focused therapy, or someone can be able to I know people talk about vision board and all that. I don't necessarily do a vision board, but I know being able to cast out your goals or things that you're supposed to do through your daily routine might be able to help you focus in on lists. But mind wandering I've heard that before as well too. It was an area I wanted to look into because I saw some similarities on some things. But it's that wording as well. I mean, that raising awareness on that in the first place, you have to change the name daydreaming because I even feel bad using it, but I don't, there's just a stigma behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, almost in some ways, not a stigma, right? It's so innocuous. And so I feel bad for the people who really it's completely um harm their lives and can't get anyone to take them seriously because daydreaming is such an innocuous thing. I mean, the name is here to stay, that's fine, but it just makes it harder for people to understand. So I actually, if someone is seeking mental health care, I always recommend that they don't walk in and say, hey, I'm now that daydreaming, because it's not taught in any like psychological, it's not taught to psychiatrists, it's not taught to mental health professionals because it's not in the DSM.
Yeah, but my doctor Googles things sometimes when I'm in the room sitting with them, so I feel like they could just look it up.
That's smart, right? I actually wish more doctors would do it because Google has more information on maladaptive daydreaming than a psychological, like a class in psychology. But my recommendation is to go in and tell the person, like, I have these imaginary daydream worlds. I know they're not real, right? 'Cause you don't want them to go to the other extreme and think you're psychotic. I know they're not real, but they're taking up more and more and more of my time. I'm starting to prefer it to real life, and I'm starting to see that it's impacting my real life. And I think that way you could get a mental health professional to take you more seriously than if you just walk in and say, hey, I'm not daydreaming. Because if you do that, I mean, I've heard people told me they've gone in to see therapists or doctors, and the doctors are like, there's no such thing. And they'll be like, but I heard about it on a podcast or whatever. And they're like, don't believe everything you read, on the internet. So I think people really need to explain it. But that was not your question. The question was about treatment, I think. Was it?
Yeah, treatment options.
So again, since the research is in its infancy, we don't exactly know. I think Dr. Sommer has shown some research that certain types of like cognitive behavior therapy can help. Anecdotally, anything that helps you stay present in the here and now. So like meditation, um, all those things can help. Some people, medication has helped. For me, I ended up taking, medication that's, an SSRI, but that was typically prescribed with OCD or other compulsive thought. And that after like years and years and years and years of trying to stop this daydreaming, that's what worked for me, right? Other people, that medication didn't work, and other medications did. There's no medication specifically to treat maladaptive daydreaming. Again, it's not a legit, it's not a known entity at the moment. But what we do find is it often coexists with other mental health conditions. I think you mentioned depression. if you treat those other mental health conditions, the daydreaming may reduce. So in my case, like I have a huge family of OCD, treating the OCD helped reduce the daydreaming. Someone else, maybe treating the depression can reduce the daydreaming. Treating social anxiety can reduce the daydreaming. So right now, since there is no specific treatment for maladaptive daydreaming, that's what I recommend people do. They work on the coexisting mental health conditions.
Social anxiety, because the fact that the escape from reality a little bit is more managed, kind of so similar, a little bit like OCD, but you don't have to necessarily, you decipher that that's reality and this is my daydream, but in your daydream is more comfortable for you than it is in the public.
Yeah. And I think, certainly if you've got social anxiety and you don't like being around other people, escaping to a daydream world is a much more comfortable place, right? So I've heard many people with social anxiety come out after daydreaming. I don't, I never did. I never, was always not anxious around people. For me, it was the compulsive nature. Like I would have a scenario in my head and I'd have to do it over and over and over again. To get it just right. And it started to like again be frustrating and exhausting. So for everybody it's different, but whatever comorbid mental health issues someone has, working on those can help the daydream.
When it comes to like research on a brain scan, has that ever been tried before to see if there's an area that might light up or anything like that that could be like just some
Did
real
you re-
solid evidence?
are you just asking that or did you read about it? I'll tell you why.
I'm
Did,
generally asking that, yeah.
because the reason why I'm asking that is because I believe I am the only person on the planet who's had my brainwaves read while daydreaming. Um, I could be wrong, but as far as I know, I'm the only person in the planet. So I did this case study years and years and years ago, um, anonymously, right? So I begged my psychiatrist to write so I'll give you a little bit of history of like how I ended up getting my brainwaves read. So for years and years and years, I looked for anyone who would daydream like me. I would kind of like surreptitiously ask friends when I was a kid, like, and do you daydream like this? No one knew what I was talking about. Finally, around my 20s, I get on the OCD medication because my doctor was like, I've never heard of this, but you have a family history of OCD, let's try it. And lo and behold, these daydream worlds went away in about 6 weeks. Still could daydreaming, but not compulsive. Right. So then I kind of forgot about the daydreaming. I have all these other like physical health issues that I became like, obsessed about figuring out, forgot about the daydreaming. But then one day a friend called me who used to babysit me when I was little. And she remembered me spinning in circles and being like, I didn't know what the hell you were doing as a child. She's like, but my daughter is doing that too. Um, and I was like, oh my God, I never heard of another daydreamer. So I went to the internet and all of a sudden I found, this was before any social media. I found though, it was on a site about Indian parenting. There was an article about kids who like daydream too much. The article itself was completely not on point. It was like, kind of a kid doing mind wandering, just not paying attention. But the comments were hundreds and hundreds of people being like, oh my God, I spent hours pacing in circles. I feel like, I like these worlds better in my life. I love these daydream worlds, but I feel like I'm addicted to them. So I took that, like I printed that out and took it to my psychiatrist and was like, you have to write me up as a case study because all these 100 people don't know about like the medication I'm taking, like they need to know. So he wrote me up as a case study. Back then it was pretty early in my legal career and mental health was not as destigmatized. So I did not have my name on the paper. But then a reporter reached out and he wanted me to go public and I just wasn't, I feel bad. I was not ready to do so at the time. So that reporter was always not happy with me. But anyway, he introduced me to someone who studies people's, a researcher, Dr. Malia Mason, who studies people's brain in an fMRI machine, which is like an MRI machine, but actually sees what areas of the brain lights up. So I did that. They put me into this like MRI, like very like, you know, looked like an MRI where you can't move that much. And there were periods where they told me to daydream, and then there were periods to tell me not to daydream. Now I'm not a scientist, so I'm going to give you like what I remember in a very non-scientific way, what the results were. Um, but the first thing that researcher, her specialty was mind wandering. So she thought I'd be a very, very high mind wandering. Remember back a little earlier in the conversation, mind wandering is more like off task thought.
Task stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what she found was I actually was not mind wandering. My mind wandering happened in the periods where they told me not to daydream. When I was daydreaming, it was more looked like purposeful, constructed thought with imagery, very different from mind wandering. And then the way she described it to me was the reward center of the brain, like the area of the brain that like would light up if you were showing like a drug addict picture of their drugs, or like a gambling addict, a casino. That's the area that lit up when I was daydreaming. But those are expensive. I do not believe that's ever been repeated. I don't know if she even published that data. So it has not. I mean, I think, that needs to be done. And we also we have to have it compared to like maybe anybody who enjoys a good daydreaming reward center would light up. I don't know. Right. Like, so we need to look at like what someone who thinks they amount after daydreaming versus someone who doesn't, what the difference there would be.
I think people just need to know the severity of what it does. Like, it's weird because in society, from what I've learned and from what I've talked to and kind of looked at, it's been focused on a condition or a disorder that doesn't just hurt oneself, but harms others. And that's kind of been like at the top of the list. And then the stuff that's now getting recognized and the stuff that's slowly getting recognized is stuff that's more self-destructive. I know addiction's up there, but like ADHD, things that weren't necessarily considered before, it's been a slow process. Because I mean, when you talk about someone destroying their own life and you just go like, oh, you need to go like someone to help you figure out your inner whatever, and then but this is like, I mean, if you have a disorder or if it's just this form of daydreaming that's causing you to literally lose friends, maybe even lose jobs, lose any ambition to want to go explore anything. I mean, you can't have people in their 20s that are getting diagnosed with depression when really they're just like laying down and being in their little world. I mean, I just, when it comes to raising awareness, I mean, has social media platforms, have you noticed people having conversations about this a little bit more? Like TikTok, I never recommended until I came across ADHD stuff. And then I saw some stuff on maladaptive daydreaming, but I wonder if that's giving more education and taking out the little bit of the stigma of it.
So what's interesting, you asked like such good questions, because what's interesting is social media is way ahead of researchers. Like this is maladaptive daydreaming is a very good example of a community that found each other online, right, at a time where science and researchers said there's no such thing, right? And to this day, there is often more correct information on social media than there is if you go to a mental health professional. And it's frustrating because I certainly can't, as a responsible adult, I can't say, go get your mental health advice on TikTok, right? But the reality is there might be more accurate information on TikTok than any, doctor is going to know, other than Dr. Sommer and a handful of researchers. So I was really upset. I don't know how long, maybe a year ago, the Wall Street Journal came out with an article saying, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, don't quote me on that, but they came out with an article saying that young girls were diagnosing themselves with rare disorders on TikTok, and what an awful thing that was. And it isn't a great thing, right? But if a parent was to do the responsible thing and take their child to a doctor after they said, hey, I saw this on TikTok, I think I have it. The doctor, and I've heard this from people, the doctors have said there's no such thing. Don't believe everything you see on TikTok. But yet, like, I've done some work on TikTok, like explaining the research Dr. Sommer has, like right now, there's more information on TikTok. And I feel like that article should have been rewritten to saying young girls are getting blown off by doctors, so they feel like they have no choice but to turn to TikTok.
No, I'm not a big advocate for ADHD medications. I just say like that's not everybody's choice. I get it works. I understand, but I entered that world with ADHD researchers and got immediately pushback from some of the older researchers because there is plenty of good evidence to support. I was like, yes, but I'm 25 and you're asking me to try it now. I just don't, there's got to be a way I can hone this about myself if it's about me. And I think, there's a resistance to a lot of stuff that like if it's on social media, like they always talk about ADHD and social media has been like the worst thing, people giving advice on there. I was like, yeah, well, of course you're gonna have people with individual experiences and things of that sort, but it's not necessarily about it, but it's at least raising awareness about it and kind of educating it. I mean, if more of society that doesn't experience this starts coming across this in their algorithm feeds, then now you're getting awareness about the certain subject. They might not experience it, but at least they can educate. I mean, for me, a better thing would have been just educating others on what I'm experiencing. So I just don't look like I'm just trying to be annoying on purpose. Like it's those similar things. You can see the same thing with this form of daydreaming is if people can understand like, okay, there's what I do and then there's what some other people do. And I should be able to understand that more. And maybe when a person's kind of zoning out, there's a specific reason I can maybe find some similar ways to connect to help pull them back from it a little bit, not take them away from their escape, but just tell them like, hey, we can do something that could be similar or fun as well too. And maybe they don't want to spend so much time in there to the point where they can actually experience the real world. So you don't wake up and be like, oh my God, it's what if I'm 40 years old and I did this or something like that. Like it's not, I'm not saying anything bad about that. I'm just saying experiencing, you don't want to miss out on those experiences, which there's a lot of FOMO out there already. So I have to feel like it's even worse with people that, tend to want to just live in their own realities. To them, it's fun. It's fun for me. But at the same time, I get moments where I'm like, oh, if I would have did that or if I would have did this, but instead what I do, I spent my Saturday sitting inside the house and just staring up at the popcorn ceiling that I have. The ceiling that has like the rivets in the top of it.
Like people would say, is it, a lot of people spend all Saturday playing video games, which isn't great for you either. And they'll be like, well, is that a disorder? I mean, honestly, at this point, I'm thinking that some people do have video game addictions. I don't know. All I can say is for me, like the first half of my life, I was dealing with this, and the second half so far, I have not been. And in my life, I've been much more content. Like it's just, this not feeling this compulsive need to like, always have my mind in two different places. Um, it's just I'm a much happier person because of it. So for me, it was, I think it was important to get the help and to work on it. But there
It's
are a lot. Oh, go ahead.
I will say it's interesting to me that there's that stigma though with the researchers because look at YouTube. How many people don't have a dad that learned how to change their oil in their car from YouTube? And we don't even bother looking at that as like, oh, that's just YouTube. Don't trust that. So it's like if social media, I mean, if you were a kid, when you were a kid and you would have saw something like social media that would have gave you a template or gave you some just basic things to find you to connect to somebody else that might be experiencing similar things, or just be able to give you some guidance and tips that's helping out in their own life. As long as it's not anything like life threatening, obviously, but if it's something like, hey, when you wake up maybe or before you go to bed, try some water or try something or something like that, that could be so simple that could
Yeah.
have helped you out in the long run as well too.
Yeah, I mean, now we're getting a little far from now that daydreaming, but I am finding like that the world is like kind of just dividing between like social media is so important, but then science and researchers are like, no, that's terrible, right? It's not just been with maladaptive daydreaming. I've had some health issues in my life where, I got better answers from support groups on the internet than I did with doctors. And I've tried to show the doctors these websites and they're like, no, that's not science. I'm like, it might not be science, but when thousands and thousands of people are saying that they're experiencing the same thing, that means something. And at least that should be something that science looks at. But there's this everything's about social media. And then you have these people like in science and academia who like, that's garbage.
Has there been research to show if there's a certain gender that might experience this form of daydreaming more than the other?
That's a good question for Dr. Sommer. I would have initially said women more, but I've heard both. So I don't know.
Most of the comments I've come across that happen to deal with like this form of daydream, they've been mostly seem like women. So to me, I was just like, I don't know. I haven't
I
come
mean,
across a lot of guy experiences.
I definitely have heard more. I've heard both, but I've heard more women, but I wonder if the women just talk about it more,
That's
right?
true.
Like, so I'm not I'm not really sure. Because actually when it comes to like parents of kids, it's been a lot of there's been a lot of little boys. So maybe it's, as kids grow up, the boys don't want to talk about it as much. I don't know. Yeah,
And
much.
have you like, I mean, future goals when it comes to besides raising awareness, but like a site dedicated to being able to have like a community forum or things of that
Uh,
sort to be able to share and exchange?
Oh yeah, so this is exciting news. So Dr. Sommer has and researchers and advocates around the world, and I am one of them, are forming a new nonprofit uh, regarding like a global nonprofit for maladaptive daydreaming, the International Society for Maladaptive Daydreaming, and we should be launching soon. And the whole goal there is to raise awareness, both among the public, but also among researchers to get people to take it more seriously. So that is right now, there's tons of chat rooms, there's tons of websites, but there's nothing that's from professionals that kind of tries to bridge that gap between researchers and people who suffer from it. So we're really excited that should be happening we've been working on it for like a year, but it should be launching in a couple months.
Do you find that a lot of people come out anonymously about it just because they don't want to put their name to something in case they get labeled a certain way?
Yeah, I certainly that's how I was for a long time. I do feel like these days people are realizing that everybody has something and it's just a lot. Mental health is more discussed than it used to be. Um, when I first came out in that Atlantic piece, lots of reporters wanted to talk to like other people not after daydreaming, and it was almost impossible to find people to want to go publicly. Now like there's lots of people doing it, and I think that's just because we're living in an age where people are talking about mental health, which is a really good thing, and for like things that you're doing, like this podcast, so thank you. Right, you know you're talking about the ADHD, you're talking about your daydreaming, like that, all of that helps. And I think it is getting less and less destigmatized.
You think with the younger generation of doctors that'll probably be hitting the fields a little bit more, you'll have more a little bit of that openness to these types of ideas as well too, and these types of, I mean, just open-mindedness when it comes to coming across something that someone might have researched and be able to look into. I see that with a lot of the older ones I talk to, but some of the newer ones, like if I talk to someone who's my age or someone maybe a little bit older, they tend to like, oh yeah, well this is actually this. I'm like, that's funny. No one really that I've talked to about like neuropsychology or anything like that has ever mentioned that before, but they've always been a little bit older.
Yeah, I think it's getting better. I still think they drill in, I have a lot of friends and family who are doctors, or I think they still drill into your head about like science, 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 and like to ignore kind of what they call anecdotal evidence. But I am seeing for sure, like, I don't know if we were talking earlier or recent, like just Googling, right?
Yeah.
Like doctors should feel comfortable Googling, because there's not only at this point on maladaptive daydreaming, not only are there those chat rooms, there are at least now 50 real research articles. So if a doctor would just take the time to like Google it, they would see that there's real research, real empirical research. And just because it's not yet in the DSM doesn't mean it's not real. And I am hopeful that we're getting a new generation of doctors that are more willing to look things up.
I wonder if PubMed or someone would do a study. Do you have any backers or anybody that would fund, like from an organization or an institution that would be able to put a lot of money behind an actual study to maybe get a more publicized paper out there? I know there's 50, but one that hits the real headlines of the whole scenario.
I mean, I think doctors like Sommer, and they're working on, getting much bigger research grants. There's been some, right? And that there's those 50 articles. But there certainly has not been enough, right? And there's just not, I get emails from people all the time asking for people who specialize it. I'm like, you gotta go to Israel, or now I know someone in Brazil. Like, there's no one in the United
Why
States.
is that? Why is that?
I just think it's like, look, Dr. Sommer landed on something, and you got to give him so much credit because he was willing to, use the internet sites when people in the field were like, no, that's not science. So he started it, and I think he started research, like reaching out to colleagues, and got some more colleagues on board. But I just don't think there's been a researcher or doctor in the US who's taken that on. Hopefully they will at some point.
Well,
Um, yeah, absolutely.
Jayne, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show about this, and hopefully, this might educate some people on maladaptive daydreaming, at least to look it up. I mean, it doesn't hurt. I was Googling for a little while, like probably a couple of weeks ago, and I was really trying to figure out what this was and if I was experiencing it or not. But I appreciate the time you gave me and the work that you're doing as well, too. But is there a place where people can find your links?
Yeah, I can actually send them to you. I do have a TikTok related to maladaptive daydreaming, and we have a newsletter actually that's pretty cool. It's written by people from the maladaptive daydreaming community for people, and it's all about like how to thrive and live with maladaptive daydreaming. So I can share some links with that for you.
Yeah, send me your TikTok because I'll follow it for sure. And
Absolutely.
I'll link all your links in the description. Like I said, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.